43 people lived in the village of Harasti when the winter of 1905 came down from the high Carpathians. By the morning of the 17th of January, every one of them was gone. I was the man they sent to find out why. My name is Andras Fekete. I served as a district gendarme in the Transylvanian highlands for 22 years, beginning in 1896 and ending when the war and its aftermath took everything I had known and replaced it with a world I recognized only in pieces. In those 22 years, I worked cases of theft, murder, disappearance, arson, and all the crimes that isolation and poverty and winter confinement produce in mountain communities. I was stationed at a small post in the foothills south of Bran, responsible for a district that covered several hundred square kilometers of mountain valley, high forest, and the scattered settlements that occupied whatever level ground the Carpathians offered. It was difficult and solitary work, and it suited me. I was not a man given to imagination. I was trained to observe what was in front of me, record it accurately, and reason from evidence to whatever conclusion the evidence supported. I had done this work for 9 years by the time the Harasti case came to me, and I believed I had seen most of what a mountain district could produce in the way of human catastrophe. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand what kind of man I was before January of 1905. I want you to understand the degree of evidence that was required to alter my beliefs about what was possible in those mountains. I've spent 40 years since that winter being very careful about what I say and to whom I say it. See, I'm an old man now, and the world has changed enough that I no longer feel the same restrictions that once applied, and I have decided to set down what I know in an account that will be as accurate and complete as I can make it. The Carpathian mountains in winter are unlike anything I've seen in the lower country. The transformation that occurs between autumn and the deep cold months is total and absolute. In summer, those mountains are filled with life. The forests are dense and green and full of sound, bird song and running water, and the movement of deer and fox and the smaller animals in the undergrowth. The meadows above the tree line are bright with short grass and wildflowers, and farmers drive their cattle up to graze while the weather holds. The valleys between the ridges collect warmth and hold it, and when the mountain streams run clear and fast from the snowfields above, and the villages that sit in those valleys are connected to each other and to the lower country by trails that a man can walk easily in a day. In winter, none of that exists. The first snow comes in October, sometimes late September in the high valleys, and by November, the mountain landscape is transformed into something that doesn't recognize the word hospitality. The snow accumulates to depths of 2 and 3 meters in the open, more than that in the hollows and the lee sides of ridges where the wind pushes it. The trails between villages become impassable except by skis or on snowshoes, and even then a journey that takes an hour in summer can require a full day of hard work in winter conditions. The forest, which in summer is full of motion and sound, has become silent in a way that takes experience to understand correctly. It is not a peaceful silence. It is the silence of a landscape that has become entirely indifferent to human presence, that has retracted all the small welcomes it extends in the warmer months and reverted to something older and more severe. The light is thin and comes at a low angle even at midday, and the shadows under the pine canopy are very dark and very still, and the cold at altitude is not merely uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous in a way that doesn't permit inattention. I had spent 9 winters in those mountains before Harasti, and I knew them well, and I had a deep respect for what they could do to a man who underestimated them. The villages of the Upper Carpathians in January are islands, and they have no connection to each other except for the trails buried under meters of snow, and the trails are usable only by men with the strength and knowledge to navigate them. A settlement of 40 people 3 hours from the nearest other village is, in January, as isolated as a ship on an open ocean. What happens inside the settlement remains there until the weather allows someone out or someone in. In a bad winter, that can mean 2 months of complete separation. I had worked that district long enough to understand this isolation not as a fact about geography, but as a fact about human experience and what it did to people who had to maintain their lives inside it. Some handled it well, some did not. But 43 people do not simply vanish from their settlement without a trace. And smoke does not stop rising from 43 people's fires unless something has occurred that lies well outside the ordinary range of winter hardship. The first report of a problem at Harasti reached my station on the 12th of January, 1905. It came from a shepherd named Mihai Corbu, a man I knew from previous seasons as reliable and observant. He was not a man given to alarm, which made the condition in which he arrived at my station significant. He had descended from the upper valley on skis, a journey of approximately 3 hours in the conditions that existed that day, and when he came through my door he was shaking so badly that it took him several minutes to settle enough to speak clearly. He told me that he had passed along the forest ridge above the Harasti Valley the previous day, moving between 2 areas of high pasture where he kept his animals in summer and checked conditions in winter, and that from the ridge he had looked down into the clearing where Harasti sat and seen no smoke rising from any chimney. This was, as I say, unusual. Harasti was a working settlement with 43 residents in January of 1905. There were 4 functioning stoves in the village that I knew of, 2 in the larger farmhouses, and 2 in the smaller residential structures, and in the conditions that existed in the valley in January. Those stoves would have been burning continuously. The temperature in the Harasti Valley in January of 1905 had been recorded at my station, which was lower and warmer than the village, at between -15 and -22 degrees Celsius. At the village itself, elevated by another 300 meters, the temperatures would have been lower. No household in those conditions ceases to maintain fire unless something has gone very wrong. When Corbu told me there was no smoke, I understood immediately that this was not a matter of a stove malfunction or a family sleeping late. 43 people do not collectively stop maintaining fires in January. I gave Corbu food and a place to sleep, sent a preliminary message to the district office, and began preparing for an investigation. The authorization I required did not arrive until 2 days later. I used those 2 days to review what I knew about Harasti, to gather equipment, and to identify men who could accompany me to the village. From my station, the journey to Harasti in January, conditions required the better part of a day on skis and could not be made safely alone, both because of the risk of injury on difficult terrain and because I had learned by that point in my career never to approach an unknown situation without additional witnesses. I departed on the morning of the 14th with 2 foresters named Vasile and Petru. Both men worked the upper valley timber operations and knew the trail between Bran and Harasti in all conditions. Vasile the phone had worked with before and trusted completely. He was a quiet, careful man of about 50, thin and weathered, with the particular stillness of an experienced woodsman who has learned to read environments rather than simply pass through them. Petru was younger, perhaps 35, larger and generally talkative. And on the morning of the 14th, Petru said almost nothing, which I noticed but attributed at the time to the early hour and the cold. The temperature at departure was approximately -18 degrees, and the sky above the peaks was clear, which meant the cold would deepen through the day as the clouds that moderate temperature were absent. We set out before first light. The trail from Bran to Harasti climbs through a mixed forest for the first 2 hours before entering the upper pine belt that occupies the last third of the approach. The lower sections were familiar and relatively straightforward, the trail well defined even under fresh snow, the grade manageable on skis. By mid-morning we had cleared the transition zone between the mixed forest and the upper pines, and were in the high country proper. It was here that the conditions changed. The snow in the upper pine forest was deep, deeper than it should have been for mid-January. The trail had drifted in several places, the wind that comes through the high passes, filling the cuts and hollows, until the landscape was smoothed to a uniform surface that erased the trail markers. We were forced to break trail through sections of chest-deep snow, alternating the lead position because the work of compressing a path through that depth of snow was exhausting even for fit men. The effort and the cold combined to reduce our pace to something much slower than the estimated 4 hours. When we stopped at midday in a sheltered hollow where a formation of boulders broke the wind, we ate quickly and standing, knowing that the warmth of exertion would leave us fast if we stopped moving for too long. And it was during this rest that Vasile made his first observation. He had been scanning the forest around us with the habitual attention of a man who has spent decades reading woodland environments for signs, and he stopped eating and stood still for a long moment, looking at the slope on both sides of the trail. Then he said quietly that there was something wrong with the forest. I asked him what he meant. He said that in 20 years of working the upper valley, moving through this particular section of trail in all seasons, he had never once passed through without seeing the small evidence of animal life that accumulates in forest snow over time. Rabbit tracks crossing between the ferns, squirrel sign in the upper branches, the triangular marks left by birds landing and lifting from the snow surface, the irregular drag marks of a vole moving beneath the crust. He said the forest around us at that moment was entirely unmarked. The snow on both sides of the trail, for as far as we could see under the pines, was flat and undisturbed, not a track or a sign of any kind in any direction. I looked at the forest and saw what he was describing. The snow surface was smooth and continuous, unblemished by any track or mark, extending under the pines in every direction with a uniformity that in retrospect was as unnatural as anything I would find when I reached the village. I had been moving through the forest all morning without registering this because I was focused on the trail and the work of skiing through difficult conditions. But Vasile's observation forced me to look properly, and what I saw was an environment that had been emptied of small life in a way I had no immediate explanation for. I asked Vasile whether he thought a wolf pack might account for it. He said that a wolf pack moving through an area would cause small animals to retreat and remain hidden, but would not produce the complete absence of track and sign that we were seeing. He said the area showed no wolf sign either, no tracks, no scat, no territorial marking, nothing to indicate that wolves had moved through recently. He said it was the kind of emptiness he had only seen once before, when a disease had moved through a rabbit population and eliminated the primary prey species from an area, and when the absence had propagated outward until the entire small animal community of the district had collapsed. He said he did not think that was what had happened here, but he was offering it as a reference point for the scale of the absence. He also said, more quietly and without looking at me, that there were stories told in the high valleys about territories that went quiet before certain things happened. I asked him to explain. He said he would rather not until we had seen the village, and he had a clearer sense of what we were dealing with. Petru had not spoken during this exchange. I looked at him and found him staring into the forest with an expression I recognized from difficult field work, the particular blankness that descends on a person who is making a conscious decision not to process what their senses are telling them. I did not remark on it. We resumed the trail. The final approach to Harasti crosses a long ridge that runs parallel to the valley before descending sharply to the village clearing. We reached the top of this ridge in the late afternoon, with the sun already dropping behind the western peaks and the sky above us turning the particular deep orange that precedes the rapid color death of a high-altitude winter sunset. Below us, perhaps 200 meters of descent, and then the clearing where the village sat, a dark, irregular patch of structures visible against the white of the snow-covered ground. I stopped at the ridge and looked down. The village was silent. No smoke, no light, no movement. The path that ran through the village connecting the structures was unmarked by any footprint I could see from the ridge. The doors of the structures I could identify were not visibly open, but neither was there any sign of occupation. Any detail that suggested the 43 people who lived there were going about their ordinary January activities. The village looked like a model of itself, accurate in every physical detail and entirely empty of life. I stood on that ridge for perhaps 2 minutes before starting down. I want to record this pause honestly. What I felt at that moment was not yet fear in any specific or directed sense. It was more like the recognition of wrongness, a felt sense before analysis that what I was looking at did not correspond to any explanation I yet had. I had investigated violent situations, and I knew the particular quality of a scene that had gone beyond the ordinary range of human experience. The village below me had that quality even from a distance of 200 meters, even before I had seen anything that could serve as direct evidence. I noted this feeling, and I moved forward, because moving forward was what the situation required. We descended the slope. The snow was hard-packed on the sun side of the ridge, and our skis cut through it easily. As we flattened out in the approach to the village clearing, moving across the open ground between the tree line and the first structures, I began to see the tracks. They appeared on the left side of our approach, running parallel to our path at a distance of about 15 meters. They moved in a line from the tree line on the western edge of the clearing toward the first farmhouse, which was the largest structure in the village. I stopped and moved toward them and knelt beside them to examine them in the fading light. What I saw caused me to remain kneeling for considerably longer than the examination required. The tracks were large. The impression in the snow was roughly oval, approximately 40 centimeters in length and 25 in width, with a depth that indicated substantial weight distributed over that area. The edges of each impression were clean and precise, not the ragged edges that form when an animal with claws or hooves breaks through a crust, but the smooth, defined impressions of a flat-soled foot pressing into compacted snow. At the front of each impression, 5 deep marks were pressed into the snow in a fan arrangement, spaced as a broad hand might space its fingers, thus each mark approximately 4 centimeters in diameter and 3 centimeters deep. These were not claw marks in the animal sense. They were vertical punctures, driven straight down with force, as if 5 thick fingers had been pressed deliberately into the snow. The stride between impressions was 160 centimeters, measured by laying my forearm along the snow between them. A tall man walking at a normal pace maintains a stride of approximately 70 to 80 centimeters. The impressions were moving toward the farmhouse door in a perfectly straight line without any deviation. An animal following a scent will weave and circle, will stop and backtrack, will show the hesitation of a creature processing information through smell. These impressions went directly from the tree line to the farmhouse door without a single deviation. I stood and looked at Vasile. He was looking at the tracks with an expression that told me he had no explanation for them that he was ready to share. We followed the tracks to the farmhouse door. The door was standing open, not broken, not torn from its hinges, not in the condition of a door that has been forced by a body or a tool. It was simply open, the latch sprung from its catch in the frame, swinging very slightly in the cold air that moved across the clearing. I stepped inside with my lantern raised. The interior of the farmhouse was dark and very cold. The fire in the large central stove had been out long enough for the room temperature to equalize with the outside, which meant it had been unlit for at least 36 hours, possibly longer. The stove itself was undamaged. There was wood stacked beside it, cut and ready, dry enough that it would have caught immediately. Whatever had ended the fire's maintenance had not been a failure of supply. On the table in the center of the main room, plates had been set and food had been served, a meal that appeared to have been interrupted part way through its eating. The food on the plates was frozen solid, consistent with at least 2 days of exposure to the temperatures that had prevailed in the region. Clothing was arranged on the hooks beside the door, heavy winter clothing, coats and scarves, and the large felt boots used for outdoor winter work. This detail registered with particular force. The outdoor clothing was present. Whatever had caused the residents to leave this farmhouse, so they had not left with the clothing they would need to survive outside in January temperatures. I moved through the farmhouse. In the rear sleeping room, beds had been occupied and then vacated. the covers thrown back as if the occupants had risen suddenly. In the small preparation room behind the main area, food stores were intact. Nothing had been taken. The only thing missing from the farmhouse was its residence. There was damage. The large wooden table in the center room had been broken, one heavy section of it cracked across its thickness in a way that required downward force of considerable magnitude to produce. The crack was not consistent with a fall. The table had not tipped over. It was on its forelegs and its upper surface was cracked, as if something very heavy had come down onto it from above. The wall to the right of the interior door showed a pattern of compressed wood. Not a puncture or a cut, but a broad depression that indicated pressure rather than impact, as if something very large had pressed against it from the other side. The heavy storage chest in the rear room had been displaced from its position against the wall and stood at an angle that suggested it had been moved by something pushing against it. And there was a smell, heavy and metallic and present throughout the structure in a way that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves rather than from any specific location. I recorded it in my notebook and moved to the next structure. We examined all 8 buildings in the village over the next 2 hours, now working by lantern light as the temperature continued to fall and the darkness outside the lantern beams became absolute. I will not describe each structure individually because the pattern was consistent across all of them. Meals interrupted, outdoor clothing present, signs of occupation frozen in mid-activity, structural damage inconsistent with human action, the specific smell present in every building. In the smithy, the iron anvil had been moved from its mounting, a concrete and iron base that I estimated at 250 kilograms. The anvil itself was several meters from its original position on its side, and there was no equipment in the smithy that could have moved it. There was no pulley, no lever arrangement of sufficient strength, no evidence that any mechanical means had been used. Something had simply lifted the anvil from its base and moved it across the floor. By the time we had finished examining the structures, Petru had stopped recording observations with the notebook I had given him and was standing in the doorway of the last structure, looking at the open clearing and the darkness beyond it. Vasily was moving through the buildings with the systematic attention of a man who has decided that work is the only reliable response to what he's encountering. I was writing in my own notebook by lantern light and trying to keep my observations clear and my conclusions deferred until I had more evidence. We returned to the largest farmhouse. We built a fire in the stove, working quickly to restore some warmth to the space. We ate from the provisions we had brought. We arranged a watch schedule for the night, so agreeing that one of us would remain awake at all times and keep the fire maintained. I took the first watch, from full dark until approximately 2 in the morning. The village at night was entirely silent. There was no wind. The temperature had dropped further as the clear sky radiated heat away from the mountain surface. In that stillness, the sounds of the fire in the stove and the occasional settling of the timber walls in the cold were the only sounds I heard for the first 2 hours of my watch. I was seated near the window that faced the open ground to the east, watching the snow surface for movement, my lantern dim to conserve oil, but sufficient to maintain my night vision for the interior of the room. The snow outside caught what light there was, and turned the clearing to a pale luminosity, just bright enough to see the tree line at the far edge, perhaps 60 meters away. I watched the tree line. At approximately 10:30 in the evening, I heard something. I want to be precise about this because precision matters here. What I heard was not a sound in the straightforward sense of a bang or a crack or a voice. It was more like a change in the quality of the air, a low vibration that I felt in my chest before I was sure I was hearing it, a rhythmic and very deep presence at the edge of audibility. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. During those 30 seconds, I sat completely still and focused everything I had on listening. The sound did not repeat. When it stopped, the silence that followed it was different from the silence that had preceded it, denser and more intentional, as if something that had been in motion had stopped. The tree line was still. The clearing was still. I had no evidence beyond the felt quality of that changed silence that anything had moved. I woke Vasile. I described what I'd heard. He listened carefully and then said that he wanted to check the tracks outside to see if there were new impressions. I agreed, and we went out together, leaving Petru asleep near the stove. The tracks we had examined earlier, the ones leading from the tree line to the farmhouse door, were unchanged. But as we moved around the perimeter of the village with our lanterns, scanning the snow at the forest edge, Vasile stopped me and pointed to the eastern side of the clearing. There was a new set of tracks. They came from the tree line on the eastern edge of the clearing, moving toward the village in the same straight, deliberate line as the tracks we had examined on arrival, and they were identical in size and stride and character. These new tracks came to within 20 meters of the nearest house and then stopped. I mean this precisely. The tracks simply ended. There was no turning, no change of direction, no backtracking, no indication that whatever had made them had turned and returned to the forest. The last impression in the sequence was clear and complete and fully pressed into the snow, and beyond it was undisturbed surface with no further impressions in any direction. Whatever had made those tracks had ceased to leave marks at that point. Vasile and I stood beside the last impression for a long time. Then I measured the stride of the approach with my arm, and it matched what I had measured earlier. I searched the surrounding snow surface with my lantern in every direction and found nothing, no marks of any kind, extending out from the last impression in all directions. There was no explanation that the physics of snow and weight could provide for this. Something very heavy had been walking toward the village and had simply stopped leaving marks. It had not turned, it had not jumped, it had not been lifted away. It had walked to this point and then existed in a way that left no evidence on the snow surface. We went back inside. I did not sleep on my off-watch hours. I lay beside the stove and stared at the ceiling and thought about what I had seen and tried to construct explanations from the physical evidence I had recorded, when I could not construct any that were fully satisfactory. I thought about the 43 absent residents. I thought about the broken table and the displaced anvil. I thought about the tracks that started at the tree line and walked directly to a door, and about the tracks that walked from the tree line and stopped in the middle of the open ground with no accounting for where the maker had gone. I had been in difficult situations before, and I had remained functional in all of them because I could identify what I was dealing with well enough to form a response. What I was dealing with in Harasti did not have a form I recognized, and this absence of recognition was producing in me something I had very little experience with. I've already described it as fear. That word is accurate but incomplete, and it was fear at a depth that operated below the level where professional discipline could reliably reach it. In the morning, when we came out into the early light and examined the full perimeter of the village, we found that something had circled it during the night. A single, continuous set of tracks ran around the outside of the clearing at a distance of approximately 30 meters from the nearest structure. The tracks ran in a complete circuit, beginning and ending at the tree line on the northern edge. The stride and impression size were identical to all the others we had found. The circuit was unbroken. It was a complete orbit of the village at what appeared to be a walking pace, and it had been made at some point during the night when one of us was on watch, without either Vasile or I hearing or seeing anything. And I stood looking at those circuit tracks and tried to think carefully about what they meant. Something had walked a full ring around the village. It had done this deliberately, at a regular pace, without deviation. Not a predator circling prey in the agitated way of a hunting animal. Not the random movement of an animal exploring an unfamiliar environment. A single, complete, deliberate orbit, the kind of movement that implies purpose and knowledge of the space being circled. Petru came outside while I was examining the circuit tracks and sat down in the snow at the edge of the clearing and did not move for several minutes. He was not injured. He was simply sitting in the snow at -20 degrees and looking at the circuit tracks and not speaking. I let him sit. I did not know what to say to him. And Vasily and I conducted a thorough search of the terrain immediately surrounding the village during the morning of the 15th. We found the circuit tracks in their entirety. We found, at 3 points around the perimeter, locations at the forest edge where the snow had been deeply compressed under what appeared to be sustained weight. Not the quick impression of a passing step, but the settled compression of a large mass, standing still for an extended period. Something had stood at these 3 points and remained motionless for long enough to press its weight into the snow to a depth of 15 centimeters. It had stood and watched the village, apparently from 3 different positions, and then it had made its circuit. We found 2 large pine trees at the northwest corner of the clearing. Both were roughly 30 centimeters in diameter at the break point, mature trees that had been standing for decades. Both had been snapped off at a height of approximately 3 meters from the ground. The breaks were clean, the wood fibers sheared across the grain in a way that required enormous downward or lateral force applied above the break point. Trees of that diameter do not snap in windstorms unless the conditions are extreme, and the surrounding trees showed no wind damage of any kind. There was no mechanism I could propose that accounted for the breaks. I stood between those 2 broken trees for a long time. I'm old now, and I have had 40 years to revisit that morning in my memory, and I can still feel precisely what I felt standing there. It was not panic. It was something quieter and in some ways worse than panic. So the feeling of a man who has been trained to reason from evidence to conclusions and who is facing evidence that leads to a conclusion his training has no category for. I made the decision to leave the village that morning. The investigative reasons were sound. We had gathered as much evidence as we could with the personnel and equipment available. A weather front was approaching from the north, and the sky had taken the flat gray uniformity that experienced mountain men know as a warning of serious snowfall within hours. If we were still at elevation when a heavy snowfall began, we would be in danger of being stranded. There was another reason. I was afraid. I had been managing this fear for 20 hours, with the discipline my training had built in me, and by that morning it had grown past the reliable containment of that discipline. And every measurement I had taken, every observation I had recorded, every piece of evidence I had examined, had contributed to a picture of something operating in that village that I had no explanation for and no response to. I was armed with a service weapon. I had 2 foresters with me who were capable men. None of this felt relevant to what the evidence suggested. The thing that had made those tracks and circled that village and broken those trees and emptied that settlement of 43 people was not something my service weapon or my experience had prepared me to address. I told Vasile and Petru that we were leaving. Neither man objected. We gathered our equipment. We put on our skis at the edge of the clearing. It was Petru who said that he wanted to move quickly and not stop until we reached the lower forest, and we set off with Vasile taking the lead. The sky above us had gone the full flat gray of an approaching weather system, and the temperature had risen slightly, the warm, moist air of the front beginning to interact with the cold, stable air over the mountains. The forest around us was as silent as it had been the previous day. Not a sound, not a track, not a sign of any life in any direction. We had been skiing for perhaps 20 minutes. We had descended perhaps 100 meters of the ridge and were approaching the section where the trail curves around a large rock formation that gives a clear view of the slope above on the left side. Vasily stopped. He stopped without warning and without speaking. He came to a halt and stood still, and I came up beside him and looked where he was looking. On the ridge above us and to the left, at an elevation perhaps 200 meters above our position on the slope, there was a figure. It was standing upright on 2 limbs. Its height I estimated at between 2 and 2.5 meters, based on its proportion to the pines beside which it stood. Its build was massive through the shoulder and chest, significantly broader than the largest human figure I had ever encountered, with a width across the shoulders I estimated at approximately 1 meter. The limbs were proportioned differently from a human figure in ways that were immediately apparent even at the distance. The arms were longer relative to the torso. The legs were thicker. The overall impression was of a figure that shared certain structural principles with a human body, but had those principles applied at a different scale and with different proportions. The surface was dark brown or black against the snow, and the texture appeared coarse, consistent with a heavy coat of dense fur rather than any kind of clothing. It was not clothed. It was standing still, and it was watching us. We stood. It stood. I do not know exactly how long we held this mutual attention. It felt very long. In the stillness of that winter landscape, with the flat sky above and the silent forest around us, the three of us on our skis and the figure on the ridge above us, time operated strangely. I was not counting. I was watching. Then it turned. It turned without any visible reaction, without startlement or aggression, with the unhurried quality of a creature that had seen what it wished to see and was now finished with the observation. It turned and moved down the far side of the ridge, and in 3 steps it was gone, below the ridgeline and out of our view. The speed of those 3 steps was the aspect I've thought about most in the 40 years since. The figure had been standing still, and then it took 3 steps, and each of those steps covered approximately 2.5 meters of ground on a steep, snow-covered slope. It was not running. The movement had the cadence of walking, but in 3 walking steps it had covered 7.5 meters and was gone from the ridgeline. No bear, no man, nothing in the taxonomy of animals I knew could produce that combination of size, upright posture, and stride. We stood without speaking for what I believe was another 2 minutes. And then Vasile turned and set off down the trail at the fastest pace I had seen him ski in the hours we had been traveling together. Petru was right behind him. I followed. We reached Bran before full dark. I filed my report to the district office over the following 2 days. The report was 9 pages in my careful handwriting, covering every observation I had made, every measurement I had taken, every structure I had examined, and every track I had found. I described the condition of the village, the displaced anvil, the broken pines, the circuit tracks, the stopped tracks, and the figure on the ridge. I used the language of my training throughout. I described what I had observed without speculation, and I let the measurements and the evidence carry the weight of the account. I did not write the word that Vasile had used when I asked him later about what the older foresters believed. The word he had said should not be written down because it carried a kind of attention. I described the figure as an unidentified, large bipedal animal of unknown species and left it at that. The report was filed and acknowledged, and then it was simply not there anymore. When I attempted to retrieve it 4 years later for reference in an unrelated case, I was told by a clerk at the district office that no such report existed. The clerk was genuinely confused rather than deliberately obstructive, unable to find the document I described. I did not press the matter, but I'd been in government service long enough to understand that there are documents that become inconvenient, and that inconvenient documents have a way of ceasing to exist. The village of Harasti appeared in the district records that followed as having been evacuated in January of 1905 due to severe winter conditions. That was the official account. No further inquiry. No names recorded as missing. No deaths recorded. 43 people who had been there in the autumn census and were not there in the spring census, disposed of in 2 words and no investigation beyond my own. I spoke with Vasile about the matter one final time, several years after the event. We were in Bran in the summer, and enough drink had passed between us to lower the careful distances we had maintained. And he told me what the 2 oldest foresters he knew had said when he described to them the tracks and the figure on the ridge. Both men had gone very quiet when he told them. One had said that the valley above Harasti had always been known by the mountain people as territory belonging to something that had lived there before any human settlement existed in the Carpathians. He said the accounts went back further than any written record, carried in the memory of the forester families who had worked those slopes for generations. He said the mountain people had an understanding with this territory, a form of avoidance that recognized the valley as not belonging to them. He said Harasti had been settled by people who had come up from the lower country and who had not known or had not respected this understanding. So the second forester had listened to Vasily describe what we had seen and had poured himself another measure of his drink and looked at the table for a long time. Then he said that it was a mercy we had left when we did. Petru left the forest service within the year after our visit to Harasti. I heard he went south to Bucharest and found work in the city. I understood why. I stayed in my district for another 13 years and did my work. I did not go back to the upper valley above Bran. I've had a long time to think about what I found in that village and what I saw on that ridge. I'm not a man who finds comfort in supernatural explanations. I've spent my life working from evidence to conclusions, and I resist the impulse to reach for categories that cannot be tested or measured. But I am also not a man who discards evidence because it leads somewhere his training has no category for. The evidence I gathered in Harasti in January of 1905 led to conclusions I could not contain within any rational framework I possessed. Something large and upright and possessed of strength far beyond any animal I could name had moved through that village, and something matching that description had stood on a ridge above me and watched me leave, and had then moved away with a stride that covered 7.5 meters in 3 walking steps. I do not know what it was. I know what I measured and what I saw and what I recorded. I know that 43 people disappeared from a mountain village in a single night and were never found. I know that the tracks around that village were unlike any animal track in any record I had access to in 22 years of mountain service. I know that the forest above Harasti was empty of all animal life before we arrived, and that the circuit in the snow was complete and unbroken, and that 2 mature pines had been snapped at 3 meters height with no mechanism to account for it. There are territories in those mountains that do not belong to human settlement. This is not folklore. It is what the evidence told me in January of 1905, and it is what I believe now. The creature that made those tracks was not a monster in the way that word is usually meant. It was not malicious in a human sense. It was something ancient and enormous that occupied a territory and enforced its occupation. And when the people of Harasti had built their lives in that territory without knowing or without caring about what already lived there, the mountain people who had been there for generations knew. They had kept their distance for reasons they understood, even if they could not explain them in terms a district gendarme would accept in a report. The forest does not belong to us. I knew this before Harasti, in the way that a man who has spent years in wild country knows certain things without being able to articulate them. But after Harasti, I knew it differently. With the knowledge that comes from evidence rather than intuition, with the specificity that comes from measurement and observation, and the long, terrible process of reasoning your way to a conclusion you do not want to reach. 43 people lived in Harasti when the winter came. By morning, they were gone, and something very old and very large stood on the ridge above the valley and watched us leave, and then walked back into its forest, and has been there ever since.